This is a lecture for my fifth hour class on the 9th of May. Anyway, there was a feeling after World War I that the United States had been suckered into that war, tricked into it. And there was also a feeling that there were alien forces out to destroy the United States, mainly coming from the Russian Revolution. I cannot emphasize enough to you how important the Russian Revolution was for the 1920s in the United States and really around the world, but in the United States. There was this feeling that communism was on the march. Karl Marx, 50 years before this, had predicted that the workers would rise up, destroy capitalism, and the communists would take over the world. And right in the middle of World War I, is there something going on? You want to sit back there or up here? There or here? Okay, well then, whatever you're doing, stop it. You notice I don't have a seating chart. I believe sophomores are old enough to decide where they can sit. But occasionally I got one that can't handle it. And they're driving. It's amazing. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. Yeah, I can't emphasize to you enough how important the Russian Revolution was so far as life around the world, but in this country as well. In the 1920s, you got the Great Red Scare. And what does the Great Red Scare mean? It means a lot of Americans who just happen to be not of the majority. And I'm not talking about race, certainly counts that, but you say, I'm a socialist. I live in a Republican town, and I'm a socialist. They're going to be persecuted for that. And that shouldn't happen in the United States. You have every right to be a socialist, a Democrat, a communist, a rock-throwing atheist in this country. And everybody may not agree with you. Everybody may not shake your hand. Everybody may not like you. Too bad. But you have the right to be that. Nobody has the right to persecute you, and you certainly should not go to jail for what you believe. Now, if you're an anarchist and you say, I'm going to put my beliefs in action, I'm going to blow up the Capitol building, well, you can go to jail for that for a long, long time, believe it or not. But so far as just having anarchist beliefs, you can have that. And nobody should be persecuted for that. And in the 1920s, if you weren't of the majority, if you weren't going along with the majority of Americans at the time and what they thought and what they did, you could be persecuted. And most of that is touched off by the Communist Revolution in the Soviet Union, which brings us to the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Okay, if I had to pick one case that maybe shows how intolerant America had become in the wake of World War I, it would be that. They were immigrants. They spoke with heavy accents. They barely spoke English, really. And all that's a strike against you in 1920s America. And by the way, speaking of anarchists, they were anarchists. They were draft dodgers. When they received their draft notice, they had fled to Mexico. All those are strikes against you in 1920s America. And then an armored car was held up. I think we did this yesterday in Massachusetts. Two guards were killed, 2 law enforcement officials. And while everybody knows that there are bad cops, like there are bad teachers and bad lawyers and bad dentists and doctors, and just put the whole list of professions out there, there are bad people. Most cops and most people who put on the uniform try and protect the public. And when a police officer, a highway patrolman, a guard like these 2 men, when they're killed, usually there's a national outcry. People want justice. People want justice. But you have to remember there is a fine line between justice and revenge. When something horrible happens, people want somebody to pay for that. And so these 2 men are going to be arrested. Get this down, Sacco and Vanzetti. And today, most people looking at this case say that they were arrested not because of anything they had done, but because of who they were. In other words, during the Great Red Scare, these 2 men were prime candidates to be persecuted by the majority. And by the way, the stolen money was never traced to them. Look, if you're accused of robbing a bank, if the prosecution can't produce the money in the courtroom and say, we found this in this guy's duffel bag upstairs in his house, you got a good chance of walking away from that. That's like, if you're accused of murder, they can't produce. What is the best evidence in a murder case?
Fingerprints.
No, not fingerprints. Well, the what?
Dead body.
The corpse. And they can't produce the corpse. There's a really good chance you're going to walk away. Well, they never traced the money to these men, nor was the murder weapon. The weapon, somebody mentioned that. That's important too. Nor was the murder weapon ever traced to them. The fact of the matter is, get this down, and then going into this case, there was a presumption of guilt. Write that down, presumption of guilt. And in this great republic, according to the Constitution of the United States, which is the rule book, in this great republic, when you go into court, I hear people, I'm going to go to court to prove myself. You don't have to prove anything. The state of Oklahoma has to prove that you're guilty. When you walk in a courtroom in this country, you are presumed to be innocent. I don't care what the evidence says. When you walk in that courtroom, you are presumed to be innocent. And if you ever sit on a jury, the judge will tell you that. I don't know what you've heard. He'll say, I don't know what you've read. I don't know what you've watched on television about this case. But this is the person but when he or she walks in that courtroom, you are to presume that they're innocent until they are proved guilty. Just the opposite was true here. In fact, the trial lasted, I think, 7 weeks. Get this down. Yeah, the trial lasted 7 weeks. And by the middle of the trial, it became pretty apparent that these two men probably had not robbed that car and probably had not killed those men. You know, speaking of juries, if you ever serve on a jury, when you go in the first day, when you go in a jury room, you're going to elect a jury foreman, the guy who runs the jury, okay, when you go in that room. And right in the middle of this trial, the jury, somebody said, a newspaper reporter covering the trial, the jury foreman, the jury was coming in and out of the courtroom, and the jury foreman passed close to him, and a newspaper reporter told him, he said, you know what? He said, I've been watching this trial now for several weeks, and he said, those guys may be innocent. And the jury foreman hesitated for just a moment. He turned, looked, and he said, damn them, they ought to hang anyway. You know what he was saying? They're foreigners, they're immigrants. They ought to hang anyway. This country doesn't need people like that. You think you're going to get a fair trial there? No. And for 7 weeks, they heard testimony. And you know, when you're on a jury, I don't care how long the trial lasts, 2 hours or 2 months, you've got to go back in the room when all the testimony is given, and you've got to sort through all that. How long do you think it took this jury to sort through 7 weeks of testimony?
About a year.
How much?
A year.
A year? 2 hours. That sound like justice to you? 2 hours. And they came back, and what was the verdict of the jury?
Guilty.
Guilty. And get this down. These two men were electrocuted to death. They were electrocuted to death. People all over the country protested this. These men went to their grave. Look at that. Sacco and Vanzetti to die. That's a workers' newspaper called the Industrial Worker. Sacco and Vanzetti to die. They said they were innocent. There's a cartoon after their death, August 27th. They appealed. And they're found guilty in 1921. I think they appealed for 6 years, but finally they were put to death. And there's Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty. It's a skull. Liberty is dead in this country, and the skull of the Statue of Liberty is resting on the death warrant of Sacco and Vanzetti. And today, most people who look at this case believe that these men were expendable. They were put to death, not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. Also in the 20s, get this down, we're talking about intolerance in the 1920s. You have the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Write that down, the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You know, by 1920, there were only 5, that's a lot, but the Klan numbers were down to about 5,000 people. The Klan was on the way out by the time of World War I, and then that changed everything. And by 1925, get this down, there were 5 million. Listen, the Klan is more powerful in the 1920s than they ever were in the history of that organization, which, by the way, still exists today. They suspect there are 10 to 12,000 Klansmen today. That's a terrorist group. That's a homegrown terrorist group. It's the first terrorist group. It's a homegrown terrorist group right here in the United States. And 1925 was their heyday. There were 5 million of them. By the way, get this down. This is nationwide. This is not just in the South. By the way, which state do you reckon had the most Klan members in it? 1925. What? Alabama. That's a good guess. Nope. Louisiana. That's another good guess. Nope. Georgia. No. What? That's a great guess. Mississippi. No.
Texas.
No. Kansas. No.
New York.
No.
Tennessee.
Tennessee. No.
Florida.
No.
Arizona.
Oklahoma. No.
Virginia.
Somebody said New York. And when they said New York, somebody said, well, that's a northern state, for God's sake. Guess what? It was a northern state. It wasn't New York, so don't give yourself a medal yet. But you're in the ballpark. You're in the ballpark. It was a northern state. The state, you would think the South. It's the South. It was Indiana. You know, you don't have to write that down. But my point I'm making is the Klan in the 20s was no longer confined to the South. It was all over the country. They burned, but listen, someone said Oklahoma, at one point, they probably controlled the majority of the Oklahoma legislature over there in Oklahoma City, making laws for the whole state. The majority of them were members of the Ku Klux Klan at one point. The Klan was very powerful in Oklahoma. There were 147 lynchings in this state from about 1890 to 1925. Most of it carried out by the Klan. By the way, it was African Americans, but it wasn't just African, white Americans, Native Americans, and a couple of people who were not necessarily citizens of the United States. Maybe they were immigrants, but 147 right here in this little state. Look, they burned Jewish businesses. They waged war against the Jews. You know what they say to the Jews? They say the Jews killed Jesus. So we got to get rid of the Jews. They burned Catholic churches. They murdered priests. They whipped people. In Texas, not far from where you're sitting, there was a bellhop. Used to, when you check, it's true. If you check into a classy hotel, they'll ring a bell and somebody will come out and they'll carry your luggage up to your room. That's called a bellhop. And there was a young African-American man working in a hotel in Texas as a bellhop. And he got off work one day and he went down to the courthouse just to see if he could register to vote. And they told him no, he didn't register to vote. And on the way home, the clerk just picked up the phone. Everybody's in the Klan, or not everybody, but picked up the phone, called the local Klan leader, said, hey, gave the guy's name, small town. He tried to register to vote. They kidnapped him on the way home, took him out in the woods, took carbolic acid, and they burned in his forehead the initials, the KKK. That's just for trying to vote. He was scarred for life. Get this down. In both large cities, write this down, in both large cities and small towns, the Klan now became the protector of America. They said there are foreign forces trying to destroy America, and the Klan said we're going to destroy those forces. Immigrants, they're not just against black people anymore. They're against immigrants and Catholics and socialists and communists. And get this down, this is a big deal. They also said this is a term you hear all the time today in our politics. We also, they said, are protectors of American family values. Get this down. We're going to make sure that everybody comports themselves in a decent way. That's what they said. So guess what? And by the way, get this down. In the 1920s, everything's changing. Society's changing. The music, get all this. The music that people listen to are changing. Clothes. For the first time, you can see women's legs. I'm going to show you some pictures here. These wild women. They've got their skirts higher than their knees. They're wearing sleeveless dresses. Before World War I, if a woman went out in public, all you could see was her face and her hands. Okay, now you can see her arms. You can see her breast. You can see her. She's got her hair cut short, dyed pitch black. That's to tick off her parents. Teenagers do things to tick off the older generation, and they're listening to this wild jazz music, and they're dancing this crazy dance called the Charleston. Parents women are smoking in public. Women are riding in cars. Women are riding in cars with boys without a chaperone. Before the war, if you went to the movies, try this out, ladies. If you went to the movies, your boyfriend came and picked you up, your aunt went with you. And you and your boyfriend sat in the seats here, and your aunt sat behind you during the movie. Would you like that? That'd be fun. It's a sad sports. Anyway, so the Klan says society's gone to hell in a handbasket, and we're going to restore morality to America. So get this down. They whipped women, whipped them. Every race. They whipped women for wearing too much makeup. They whipped women for wearing their skirts too short. They whipped women for smoking in public. They whipped women for riding alone in a car with a male. Okay? Riding alone in a car. They whipped teenagers who smoked and drank. They whipped teenagers who skipped school. They whipped people who engaged in premarital sex. And you know, if you did, there would just be a notice nailed on the tree in your front yard. The KKK is watching you. If you continued in any of this activity, one night they would see you out alone or walking or driving, and they would just pull you over, and they would throw you across the hood of your car and tear your shirt off your back, and they would lash you with a bullwhip. And like I say, they were very powerful in the state of Oklahoma. In fact, get this down, Oklahoma had over 50 sundown towns. Write that down. Oklahoma had over, here's some Klan chicks. Look at that. Look there, horses in the Klan, I guess. Poor horse, he didn't have a choice. They always have a Bible and an American flag. Klan always has that. What's that? What are they all doing? Somebody lost contact. No, they're all kneeling down in front of that fiery cross, and they're being initiated into the Klan. Klan's so strong that 250,000 of them marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the Capitol Dome of the United States Capitol there, and 250,000 of them marched by the White House and by the U.S. Capitol, just to flex their muscle and just to say to America, look at us, look how powerful we are. I got this down, sundown towns. You would go to certain towns in Oklahoma, not just Oklahoma, but in Oklahoma, and it would say right there, don't let the sun set on you here. Understand? And everybody knew what that was, and everybody knew what it was talking about. Look, sometimes whites would decide they didn't want blacks in their town anymore, and so they would storm into the black section of town and burn it to the ground, and the blacks would have to go live somewhere else. Now, even though they had chased all the African Americans out of their town, sometimes African Americans still came and worked in those towns. And the law was this: you can come here and work. And in fact, if you want to come here and shop in our grocery store and clothing store, you can do that because we want your money. But by dark, you better be out of town. And if you weren't out of town, you could be killed. That ensured that the community remained all white. Henrietta, Oklahoma, right up the road, was a sundown town. Norman, Oklahoma, pains my heart, the home of the University of Oklahoma, was a sundown town. Ada was a sundown town. Bartlesville, Marlow, where I was raised, was a sundown town in the old days. Sundown town. And on May 31st, 1921, write that date down, May 31st, 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre happened. Write that down, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And it is to this day the worst race riot, get this down, the worst race riot or race massacre, okay, the Tulsa Race Massacre in the history of the United States. Nothing has ever topped this, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And we're coming up on the anniversary of it on the 31st of this month, but it was the 31st of May, 1921, okay? About 102 years ago, just a lifetime ago. And here's what happened. Look, it happened get this down, in the Greenwood section of Tulsa. Greenwood is still there. It's a community. You know, one of the miracles after they destroyed Greenwood, the residents of Greenwood didn't go away. They stayed right there, and they rebuilt their homes and their businesses, and they exist to this day. In fact, every June, on Juneteenth, about the middle of June, if you're interested, they have a big jazz festival, and musicians come from all over the United States and maybe even the world to play at the Greenwood Jazz Festival. But that's where this race riot happened. Get this down. In 1921, Greenwood was one of the wealthiest, listen, get this, it was one of the wealthiest communities in America. It was called the Black Wall Street. It's an all-black community, the way it was. It's not today. but it was so wealthy and so prosperous, it was called the Black Wall Street. In fact, it had some of the best schools in America. One of those schools still exists to this day. Which school? And today it's a math and science academy. They send people to Yale and Harvard, all of these. What was the name of that school?
Booker T.
Huh?
Booker T.
Booker T. Washington. Yeah, one of the oldest schools in the state of Oklahoma, certainly one of the oldest in Tulsa. It was a fine school that had a national reputation in 1921. They had a strong business community. They had a large professional class. There were teachers, attorneys at law, doctors, dentists, and as I say, excellent schools. And on the morning of May 31st, 1921, a 19-year-old shoeshine boy, you go to the airport and these people are shining your shoes, well, today, and they charge you $20 or something. Well, people used to do that on the street. And a 19-year-old shoeshine boy named Diamond Dick Rowland. Okay, and that's because he had a big diamond ring on his hand. He was shining shoes in downtown Tulsa. That was not his name, by the way. He was born in Veneta, Oklahoma. His name was Jimmy Jones. He was born in 1903, and both of his parents died, and so he was taken in by a woman named Damie Ford, who later married a man named Dave Rowland, and so this boy, Jimmy Jones, took the name of Dick Rowland, okay, the name of his stepfather. He attended Booker T. Washington High School, where he was a standout football player, and some people even predicted when he was in high school that he might be a college football player. However, he decided he wanted to make money, so he dropped out of high school and he didn't graduate. Well, Tulsa in 1921 was strictly segregated. And every day, many people from black Tulsa went into the white part of Tulsa, and many people from white Tulsa went into the black part of Tulsa. In fact, one of the reasons why they believe that whites decided to burn down Greenwood was because the stores over in Greenwood were much better, carried a lot more materials, a lot more products than the stores in white Tulsa. And the white merchants wanted to do away with the competition. But every day, people from both sides went over to work, and a lot of African Americans worked construction jobs and different things in downtown Tulsa. And there was only one building in which they could use the restroom, and it was the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa. And the only restroom that all these black people working in Tulsa could use was on the fourth floor of the Drexel building. And on the morning of May 31st, 1921, Dick Rowland was shining shoes, and so he decided to take a restroom break, and so he went down to the Drexel building, and there was only one elevator that African Americans could use in the Drexel building, and he went to that elevator perfectly within the confines of the law, and he was going to get on the elevator. In those days, in buildings like that, they had an elevator operator in a uniform, and when you started to get in, the door did not open automatically. They had to open it and let you in, and then they would close the door, and they would say which floor, and you'd say, I want to go to the fourth floor, and they would hit number 4, and up to the fourth floor you'd go, and when the elevator stopped, they would open it and let you out. He's walking into that elevator. Nobody will ever know what really happened. He's walking into that elevator, and he tripped, or he stumbled, or he fell. Or may I just brush my hand against your arm, okay? Or if I was walking down this aisle handing out tests and I'm going to get your arm, I can't see. And I did that, okay? Something just like that, something real simple. Nobody really knows what happened, but this girl was a 17-year-old white girl. Her name was Sarah Page, and she's about your age, and she screamed rape. And with that, Dick Rowland ran away because to be accused of rape, he knew what that meant. He would probably be lynched, okay? And so the police are called, the county sheriff comes down, and he arrested Dick Rowland and took him to jail. Well, of course, this is where the yellow press takes over. You know what the yellow press is? It exaggerates. The yellow press in this instance was a newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune. It no longer exists. But it ran a banner headline that afternoon that a black man had assaulted a white woman in downtown Tulsa, which was absolutely false. But this goes back to this fear of rape, okay, going all the way back to the Civil War, and we've talked about that. this idea that while the white men, all the husbands and the sons and the brothers were all away fighting the Civil War, the white women were left there on a plantation with 100 slaves, and the male slaves raped those women. Are you awake? Sit up. I want to see your, move your hand. There you go, just like that. I want to see your face. Anyway, school's not over. I don't know what you heard, but we're still having it. Anyway, they raped those women constantly for 4 years, and that's completely untrue. There's never been one case of that uncovered by any scholar of the Civil War in 160 years. But that was a myth that stuck. Movies have been made about it. Well, you saw the movie Birth of a Nation. Books have been written about it. And that's what crossed the minds of these people. And so whites stormed down to the courthouse. Well, meanwhile, over in Greenwood, these African Americans here, that a young African American man is down at the jail, and armed whites are gathering around the jail, and they know what's about to happen. So 75 of these African Americans, many of them World War I veterans, and some of them put on their old World War I uniforms. They armed themselves and they went down to the courthouse. And what you have at the courthouse is a standoff. You've got whites on this side and blacks on this side, and both groups are armed. And a white man tried to take a pistol away from a black man. There was a struggle, and the pistol fired, and it looked like it was just going to be a war right there in front of the courthouse. But the sheriff, the sheriff turns out to be a pretty good guy in this story. The sheriff got his name here somewhere. Willard McCullough. And by the way, he had a deputy named Barney Cleaver. Barney Cleaver was one of the first black deputy sheriffs in the history of the United States and the history of Oklahoma. So this sheriff, who's white, and this deputy sheriff, Barney Cleaver, well, they walk out and they simply stare down the crowd on both sides. I mean, they're out there by themselves. That's an incredible display of courage. And the crowd goes away, and then those two men decide, we got to get Dick Rowland out of here. They're going to kill him. And that night they sneaked him out of town, and that probably saved his life. But the next day, get this down, the next day, whites armed themselves, and the attitude is, we must put these black people in their place. And so they marched into Greenwood, and they killed over 300 African Americans. They firebombed the city. They had airplanes dropping firebombs over Greenwood. They burned 35 square blocks of Greenwood, 1,200 homes, 12 churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 pharmacies, 8 doctors' offices, 25 grocery stores, and a wonderful public library. Anybody that will set fire to the library is about on the lowest rung of humanity, in my opinion, as they could be. A library ought to be a sacred place, and anybody that can do that, pretty low. And they did all that in just 24 hours. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Survivors of the race massacre reported bodies being thrown in the Arkansas River, people being hauled down there, 2 bodies in a wheelbarrow, and just up on the banks, just dumped them in and let them swim away. And that all happened on May 31st and on June the 1st. And eventually the National Guard is called in. Eventually troops come up from the U.S. Cavalry comes up from Fort Sill to try and restore order. But Greenwood was essentially destroyed. Of course, this won't shock anybody. Sarah Page, this 17-year-old girl, later said, well, I just made it up. He didn't do anything to me. And of course, Rowland is later going to be completely exonerated. That means no charges against him. And of course, historians have discovered since then, this is interesting, that Page and Rowland knew each other. Okay, this young African-American man and this young white woman knew each other, and they probably had dated, and they probably were planning to be married. And they wanted to be married because Oklahoma had a ban on interracial marriage, and they wanted to be the first 2 people to challenge this interracial, this ban on interracial marriage. She later said she made it all up. The charges on Rowland were dropped. He was completely exonerated in court. He left here, went to St. Louis, ended up in Oregon, became a welder in a shipyard, and in 1960, that's not that long ago, in 1960, he was killed in an explosion in that shipyard. Like I say, the National Guard finally restored order, but a lot of historians believe that whites were just looking for an excuse to destroy Greenwood because Greenwood was competing with white merchants. It was an effort to make Tulsa all white. But the miracle of it all is that after the massacre, Greenwood was rebuilt. Today there are thousands and thousands of people living there, but today there are millions of dollars, I don't know if you've kept up with it, but millions of dollars being put into Greenwood to restore it. And it is being restored to what it was, a thriving community, okay? And in 2021, the country, not just Oklahoma, the country commemorated the Greenwood Race Massacre, and there were actually, just a couple of years ago, there were actually 3 survivors. They would have been small children, but there was a woman named Viola Fletcher. She was 107. I don't know if these people are still with us. There was a young man named Hughes Van Ellis. He had just been born when the race massacre took place. He was 100. And a woman named Leslie Randall, who was 106 years old, who was a small child, and who remembered the race massacre. But this is what I want you to get, and this I want you to get down as well. So get this down. And in the wake of this, when this is all over, usually the story stops there. But as bad and as racist as the race massacre was, in the wake of this, get this down, black and white Oklahomans banded together to break the power of the Ku Klux Klan. To break the power of the Ku Klux Klan. And I'm out of time today, so I'll say a couple of words about that tomorrow, and then we'll go on to the 1920s.
Good morning. Pretty good.
What happened?
I just watched a bunch of little kids race. And
You're already done? They're already done down there?
No, but I gotta come.
You had
listen to
enough.
a lecture, right?
Yeah.
We had class.
You had
I'd
enough.
rather talk about getting with the tennis.
Can I leave?
I've asked a few people this question and the results are indecisive. What do you think wins in a fist fight? If World War II came down to it, Winston Churchill or Adolf Hitler? Who do you think takes it?
I don't know. I'm biased toward Churchill.
Prime Churchill.
I tend to believe in the end the good will win, so. I bet Hitler was a scrap, but Hitler wasn't that big. You know, the other thing about Hitler that I tell students, he never learned to drive.
Yeah, I know, I'm just saying.
I think
I got the Williams in 7.
Churchill had the weight on him. He weighed 230 pounds, and he was only about that tall.
If you're sports betting, you're going to tell me
The average.
Steph tomorrow is dropping 50 points minimum.
Was Prime Churchill
He's just saying an NBA record.
It's gonna be hot. My shirt's gonna be hot. I'm gonna need somewhere. I'm probably right.
You know how LeBron is an actual good team? LeBron himself would not have some insane game winning. It's just that other teams are actually scoring. Now look at Jordan still at 10 minutes in the game.
Warriors or the Lakers won?
The Lakers.
The Lakers beat them.
Yeah, so it's good one. That's why I got this for the Warriors in 7.
We sure didn't think of that. it's so hard to win 3 straight games.
Mr.
It's been
It
done
is
before.
hard, but
It's been done like 4 times.
Exactly. I mean,
Freshman,
LeBron,
Montgomery, is he here?
he is, isn't he up to state with the?
Be a senior.
I think he's at the golf though.
Yeah, I think it's a golf thing regardless.
Bro, I can wear that.
You already have them.
That's what I'm saying.
It's basically the same thing. You just swing the ball.
Graduate.
Yeah.
Graduate.
Graduating is great.
He said it's going.
There's high school with y'all.
That's not coming on. That's on there. Dude, I can feel that.
Scared, it's more like I know I can't be bad. I don't care enough to be scared. I just can't do it.
Wait till what? That's what I did in English every time. I just waited for him to lose the thing and I'd be like, what's going on?
So long.
I'll be like, and that would be like so.
You guys scribble out or
He's
something.
would not help me out. I was like,
That is cat.
but did you like 50 questions? You know?
I think one time we were asking you questions, middle of test, and you were dead asleep at home. You were asking questions, I'm like, bro, I can't help that.
I didn't know Bud was going to sleep at like 8 o'clock though. It's like,
Jump on straight, take the pre-nap.
Pre-sleep nap.
Pre-sleep nap.
Pre-sleep nap is ridiculous. I'm not gonna lie.
Nobody doesn't go to sleep. You get up, grab some soup, and then go to bed.
Go to bed. Oh, nice. I don't. That's why I can't take naps because my body will like not be tired of it.
Bro, I can see.
That's not a nap. I hope in college I'll become a nap.
if you get one so now
Nice.
it's the day.
Yeah, college.
You're not like grinding.
I swear, you need to like a
38.
You swear. Was it Maddox's mom?
Well, this is you, I need you. Unless you just. I said she's been, I'm like, it's like,
I really
Yeah.
Going to. So going to.
We taken like
Senior video.
90 tests.
They just call it on
45 tests.
Okay.
I'm coming.
Maybe
Maybe a little more than 45. I like.
Maybe less on the 7 to 11.
I sound
Come on, you can 11.
I'll, 11.